Good morning and welcome everyone to the sixth meeting of the Local Government and Communities. Please ensure all mobile phones are on silent. A reminder that broadcasting will operate your camera and microphone as usual. Please allow a short pause before being called on to speak to allow them to do so. We've received apologies today from Annie Wells and Jeremy Balfour is here as committee substitute. Agenda item 1, we have consideration of whether to take agenda item 9 in private. This is consideration of the evidence heard on budget and local government settlement 2021-22. As we're all meeting remotely, rather than asking whether everyone agrees, I will, as usual, instead ask if anyone objects. If there's silence, I will assume you're content. Does anyone object? Thank you very much. Then that is agreed. Item 9 will be taken in private. Agenda item 2, the committee will take evidence in the draft Property Factors Code of Conduct, Scotland Order 2021. And I now welcome Kevin Stewart, Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, Mandy Callaghan, the Head of Private Housing Services Unit, Stephen Leishon, the Senior Policy Officer, Property Factoring, Scottish Government. This instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means that Parliament must approve it before the provision can come into force. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda items to consider the motion to approve the instrument. I remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows. And I now invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener. But we'll do the best that we can. Can I thank you for the opportunity to join the committee today as part of your consideration to bring the draft order into force, a revised code of conduct for property factors provided for under the Property Factors Scotland Act 2011. The code is one of 3 key elements in the property factor regulatory regime, alongside the register and the first tier tribunal. And it plays an important role setting minimum standards of practice for registered property factors and providing protections for homeowners who use their services. I'm very grateful to those homeowners, property factors and other stakeholders who have taken the time to respond to the consultations and who have engaged positively with my official to provide their views on the changes we propose to make to the code. The process has been iterative and we have been able to adjust proposals in order to make them more workable. And these revisions bring the code up to date and strengthen it in 4 key areas. First, helping homeowners understand what to expect and whether the property factor has met its obligations. And this includes clarification on the various situations where, when and how homeowners should expect to be provided with a copy of the written statement of services and other documentation. Next, highlighting that homeowners have a choice in who they appoint and that they can change factor. And this is done by requiring a property factor to provide clear information to homeowners on how they can end their factoring arrangement and the arrangements it will make to cooperate with another property factor to smooth transition. Third, improving transparency. For example, taking a broader approach to the requirement to declare financial interests and requiring the issue of an annual insurance statement. And finally, improved consistency in how the code is applied, for example, by including standards of practice and a glossary of terms. Property factors have generally received the code positively and see potential for reducing the number of complaints that they receive. Implementation provides an opportunity for property factors to review their current processes, procedures and documents, driving improvement. The order that the committee is considering today proposes that the revised code will come into force on the 16th of August of this year, and we have engaged with property factors on timing. While businesses are understandably busy at the moment, I believe that this is sufficient time to allow them to assess and to implement the changes. And I want to encourage homeowners to be proactive in maintaining the common parts of their property where they have chosen to engage a property factor. It is important that they know what they should reasonably expect and how to hold their factor to account. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you very much, Minister. We now move on to questions. If anybody has a question, I'd be grateful if you just type R in the chat box. Thank you. Sarah Boyack, please.
Thanks, Convener. Can I just ask the Minister if there is any analysis of what failures we've had with the code that these changes are hoping to address in terms of homeowners not feeling they're getting a proper service? The big issues in my mailbag, you've already mentioned common repairs. The other issue I've got in the mailbag is how cladding problems are remediated, and I was wondering if these changes will help homeowners get the action they need on those issues. Thank you.
Convener, thank you. I very much hope that this will make things very much easier for homeowners. I think we've got still more work to do as a parliament in terms of communal repairs, and I'm very grateful to the cross-party group that has been put together to look at tenements and the work that is ongoing at this moment with the Scottish Law Commission in terms of how we move forward on. All of this should make things much more transparent. Members will be well aware that there have been some high-profile cases in Parliament, high-profile cases which have been mentioned in Parliament about property factors who have failed in their duties. And I think that, again, this makes it much more helpful in terms of residents being able to hold their factors to account. And beyond that, we as a government will continue to look and see what more is required if this in itself is not enough. Rather than going into the individual cases, we have a situation where we have ongoing work which involves Police Scotland in terms of dealing with factors who are not dealing with this as they should. And of course, as the committee is well aware, we have actually removed factors from the register in recent times.
Thank you. Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Minister, I very much welcome this process because I do believe that it is going to tighten up, as you have indicated, and support homeowners, and it's robust enough that it will remove some of the anomalies that we seem to have had in the past to ensure that factors do fulfil their obligations and are supporting and assisting tenants in that whole process. And if there are factors who are not up to standard, then that is highlighted in this process. The issue I have is, do we think the timescales are enough? You talk about the 16th of August being the time that this, during the pandemic and all that we're having to deal with, have you any indication of that is a suitable timescale for everything to be completed by?
Convener, I do think that the 16th of August is a suitable timescale, but as always, we will continue to monitor things as we progress. Many of these changes should be simple to implement to provide that greater degree of transparency for residents. I don't think that any of this is overly onerous, but what it does do is, I hope, provide a better service to residents, and it lays out the roles and responsibilities of all parties in all of this. We have at this moment 390 property factors who are registered. My expectation would be that all 390 of them comply with these changes by that 16th of August date.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. Thank you, Alexander.
Thanks very much, Convener. In Edinburgh, we don't have a history of using property factors. Previously was Edinburgh Council's statutory notice system, and we know the problems that happen with that. I'm just wondering if these changes will do anything to encourage property owners in Edinburgh to actually employ a factor, because the issues that Sarah Boyack raised are similar to the issues that I have in my constituency.
Convener, I hope that more folk will be encouraged to use property factors. In terms of the cross-party group that's been looking at communal repairs and other matters, you know, they have very clearly said, you know, that we need to improve this system, and we will look at all of that as we move forward. I think that what we require is a situation where folk are willing to sign up to property factors, but in that case they have to trust the property factors that they are signing up to, and be well aware of what that actually means and the services that are provided. I think that these revisions to the code goes a long way in terms of spelling out exactly what the expectation should be, and I think that that in itself will be helpful in encouraging more folk to look at whether a property factor dealing with their building is the right thing for them. So I would encourage Mr. MacDonald and others to say to owners and buildings who are not covered to look at all of this, see what services can be provided for them, and to look very closely at whether signing up to a property factor is beneficial to them. And as I say, in the long run, hopefully not so long, but in the future, hopefully we can do more in terms of improving the issues that arise in terms of communal repairs and other things. And if you don't mind, I'll avoid Mr. MacDonald's hark back to history in terms of what happened in Edinburgh, because if we started on that, we might be here all day.
Yeah, I'd prefer if we weren't, so I'll move on to Keith Brown.
Hey, thanks, Convener. Just very quickly, I think it's a sensible set of changes. I think I was the Minister responsible for bringing the code in originally, but the concern that I have, and I cannot remember now, is that in my constituency, most of the issues were with people who didn't want a property factor but bought a house and found out they were subject to a property factor. Is that something addressed by this code, or is that addressed elsewhere, Minister?
No, that's not addressed by this code, but I think one of the key things in all of this is it makes it much easier for folks to change property factors. I think that Mr. Brown may have experienced similar things to what I have in my constituency, where folk were happy enough having a property factor, but they didn't necessarily want the property factor that had been imposed by the developer at that particular point in time. This makes it much, much easier and much more transparent for folk in terms of changing property factors. And I think that that is extremely important, because I, for one, going back to the past, you know, have had experiences in my own constituency where folks were not getting a level of service that they expected to do. And then they had some real difficulties in terms of getting the information to change the factor to one that they had found that they believed would provide a better service. All of that should be ironed out here so that people can make those choices, which I think is very, very important. And I do realise, Convener, that there will be some folk out there who don't necessarily want property factors, but I think that this is the right way to go in order to deal with some of the difficulties that many of us face in our constituencies around about dealing with some of the communal repairs. And I hope that as we move forward, forgetting the code and other aspects of this, that we can do much better in terms of bringing resolution to some difficulties that have been around for quite some time.
Okay, thank you, Minister. We'll now move on to agenda item 3, which is formal consideration of motion S5M 23919, calling for this committee to recommend approval of the Draft Property Factors Code of Conduct, Scotland Order 2021. We have just taken evidence on. I invite the Minister to move the motion and speak to it if he has anything further to add.
Convener, I move the motion. I have nothing further to add. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If any members would like to contribute, then please do put the R in the chat button. In that case, as nobody's asked to contribute, the question is that motion S5M 23919 in the name of the Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning be approved. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. That is agreed. The committee will report on this instrument in due course, and I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. I thank the Minister and his officials for taking part in this meeting, and I will now suspend briefly to allow a witness changeover. Thank you. At item 4, the committee will now take evidence from the Minister on the Homeless Persons Unsuitable Accommodation Scotland Modification and Revocation Coronavirus Order 2021. Andy Wyman has tabled a motion to annul this negative instrument, which will be taken at item 5. This item is an opportunity to take evidence from the Minister and officials before we move to that formal debate, and I welcome back Kevin Stewart, the Minister for Local Government, Housing and Planning, and with him are Marion Gibbs, Team Leader, Homelessness and Housing Related Social Security Unit, and Myra Quinn, Policy Officer, Homelessness and Housing Related Social Security Unit, Scottish Government. Minister, do you wish to make any opening remarks before I ask members if they have any questions?
Yes, please, Convener, and thank you very much. I thank the committee for giving me the opportunity today to outline the work which led to the laying of the Homeless Persons Unsuitable Accommodation Order Modification and Revocation Order 2021. It's clear from the First Minister's daily updates that the COVID-19 pandemic is far from over, and we have seen a variant strain of the virus move quickly through Scotland, causing a sharp rise in cases in recent times, increasing the threat to public health considerably. Lockdowns in response to the pandemic, significant impact on the availability of both temporary and settled accommodations, where restrictions on local authorities and registered social landlords resulted in slower turnover of void properties, resulting in lower number of allocations, which are not back to normal levels. With this in mind, I agreed to further extend the temporary coronavirus exemptions within the Unsuitable Accommodation Order. And you will see, Convener, from COSLA's letter of the 22nd of January to you that the decision was reached with the full support of local authorities who have worked tirelessly since last March to keep people safe, supported, and provide them with somewhere warm to live during this public health crisis. Since extending the order to all homeless households in May, we have worked in partnership with local authorities and their intelligence, alongside data collated by the Scottish Housing Regulator, demonstrated that while voids are now being turned over and allocations to homeless households are being prioritised, the impact of the additional pressures on the system are continuing to be felt. The result is that some councils would not be in a position to cease using emergency provision in hotels and bed and breakfasts by January. And this includes those that did not use bed and breakfasts prior to the pandemic. Therefore, the decision to extend the exceptions until the 30th of June 2021 was made to take account of the enormous impact that we are all facing, and to take account that the ongoing pandemic is having an impact on the housing system and councils. The extension ensures that people are kept safe from the pandemic, keeps people off the streets, and knowing where people are, and it allows wider support to be provided, including setting up pathways to settled accommodation. I want to make it absolutely clear, Convener, that I am committed to reducing the number of people staying in all forms of temporary accommodation, which we are doing through rapid rehousing and improving its quality. And that's why I extended the Unsuitable Accommodation Order in May 2020, creating legislation that responded to the pandemic and made clear that when possible, we wouldn't just return to our previous homelessness system. Unsuitable Accommodation Order guidance was published on the 31st of January to help local authorities set parameters, ensure the correct structure to aid recovery is in place, and to build on their rapid rehousing transition plans and exit strategies that are part of the framework to deliver homelessness services and ensure that no homeless group is disadvantaged as a result. I hope, Convener, that the committee today will recognise the efforts that are going on and will vote accordingly not to annul this SSI. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. Before I bring in Sarah Boyack, can I just ask a couple of questions? I mean, we know that COSLA backs the extension, but what about the frontline organisations who work with the homeless people? For example, are they saying that the people are happy to remain in temporary accommodation at this stage? Do they feel safe, or are they concerned about the accommodation that they're in? And what do the organisations say about what is needed to support people at this time?
Convener, as the committee is well aware, I have regular meetings with frontline organisations because I want to know exactly what is going on out there. And I met with a number of the frontline organisations last week to discuss all of the issues that they are dealing with at this moment in time. And let me give you an example from Glasgow. And I think the frontline and the voices of those folks with lived experience who are dealing with all of this at this moment in time. And examples were given to me of folk being moved on from hotels and bed and breakfasts in Glasgow to mainstream housing but not everything was in place in that mainstream housing. And folk were telling the people on the front line that they would rather have stayed in the bed and breakfast and hotels until every aspect was sorted. And I think that folk have also got to understand that for many of the most vulnerable folk, the support that is being provided in hotels is coming from various agencies, and that is support that would not necessarily be available as we move them into mainstream housing at this moment. And although we are allocating some properties in terms of housing first with that support, we are not getting as much of that through as I would like. So I think in all of this, we have to listen to the frontline folk and to those folks with lived experience about what is going on for them at this moment. And when folk are saying to me that, you know, at this moment, the hotel might have been better for them than moving into mainstream accommodation that was not quite ready for them, I have to listen to that.
Sarah Boyack, and then Andy White.
Thanks very much, Convener. Can I draw members' attention to my register of interest, my former employment with SFHA? Minister, I found it very useful to see both the Scottish Government's feedback on this issue in terms of why you want us to support the order, but I also found the submission we had from local authorities very useful, and I just want to ask a couple of questions on that, because it appears that although more homeless households have been given lets, that's gone up from 308 to 960, and that we've got an increase in homeless households being given temporary accommodation that's now gone up to 3,195 over the 6-month period. There's survey analysis. It does say that there's now over 14,000 people in temporary accommodation, 14,000 households in temporary accommodation in Scotland. Do we have a breakdown by local authority? Because that's quite a significant increase in the last few months. And have we got analysis in terms of the capacity of properties? Because that looks like we've got a gap of 14,000 households needing permanent accommodation. So that appears like a massive issue to be addressed. And my second issue is about the issue of prevention of homelessness. I have both constituents who are homeless or who are worried about becoming homeless because they're currently living in inappropriate private rented accommodation. What work has been done to support local authorities and the different homeless charities to support people to get the right kind of housing and to stop them becoming homeless? Because we know that once you are homeless, it impacts on your health, impacts on your resilience, and I can't imagine what it's like in a pandemic. And finally, Shelter has given us a very useful briefing where they've asked you to set up a national temporary accommodation task force. We've got very useful information from local authorities, but it'd be good to see how that would tie together with third sector organisations that are supporting our vulnerable constituents. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Minister?
There are a huge amount of questions in there, and I would expect nothing less from Ms. Boyack in all of this. And I will bring in Marion Gibbs, I think, at a point around about some of the detail that we are doing at this moment. First of all, could I say that there has been a rise in the amount of households who have required temporary accommodation during the course of the pandemic. But those numbers are beginning to drop. But that's something that we need to keep a close eye on. Ms. Boyack asked around about, are we gathering up data from individual local authorities? The answer to that is yes. We get a weekly report looking at what is going out there. At points, I have to be honest and say that some local authorities have not managed to report at points because they're dealing with cases as going on. But you know, you could be assured that I look at that very, very carefully, and Ms Gibbs may want to say more around about that. I think that in terms of prevention, that is immensely important. And Ms Boyack is right to point that out. And that's why the work of folk in the front line, including the actions of the housing hubs, is so important in getting this right for people. And I think that what we have seen at various points during the course of this pandemic is much better multi-agency work than we've had before in order to get things right for people and to protect them during this point in time. And Convener, we have recognised, that as we come out of all of this, local authorities will need to adapt, and they need to be given time to adapt. And we have provided also resource to help for that adaptation. That's why we've put in an additional £5 million for rapid rehousing transition plans, recognising that things have changed, and that some of the things that are currently being done by local authorities will need to be refined in order to get it right for people. So a combination of things there, in terms of, yes, continuing to look at the data, continuing to ensure that numbers are going down, providing local authorities with a resource to move to rapid rehousing transition, and monitoring all of this as we go along. And while we're talking around about the unsuitable accommodation order here today, I think one of the other things which I have kept a very close eye on, and I think is as important, if not more important, is the failure to accommodate numbers, which members will remember were very high in Glasgow prior to the pandemic. And I was in constant communication with Glasgow around about that. In recent times, because of the flexibilities and getting it right for people, Glasgow, in the most recent stats that I've seen, accommodated everyone. No failure to accommodate there at all, which is absolutely immense, and plaudits to the folk in Glasgow for achieving that, because that is a big shift from where they were at previously. Convener, I will bring in Ms Gibbs, if you don't mind, around about some of the data collection aspects and anything else that she may want to add.
Thank you, Minister, and welcome to the committee. Thanks for the opportunity to speak. Just to sort of say that the data collection we have is very, very comprehensive, and I'm sure Ms Boyack has seen all the publications there as well, and we can obviously extract from our data collection as to sort of like cross-reference things and all the rest of it to make sure that we can actually find anything out. So if she has any particular areas that she wants examined, then just to get in contact with us through the Minister whenever, and we can get some information there too. But just to sort of like back up what the Minister was just saying there about the increase in temp accommodation, but there was a really interesting sort of like thing that happened was that where people, the applications didn't necessarily increase during the time of the pandemic or the early parts of the pandemic. But what did happen was that a lot of people actually required to be provided with temporary accommodation because their alternative sort of like situation wasn't available for them. So where they might have stayed with family and friends and they couldn't actually do that because of the way that the lockdown happened and all that sort of stuff. So that's why there's a sort of like natural increase in temp accommodation during that time, which doesn't correlate with the actual applications coming in. So I think that's an important thing to consider as well, that people being helped. On the failure to accommodate point, in particular Glasgow, who was the main local authority that wasn't able to provide temp accommodation or didn't provide temporary accommodation, then they have made a huge jump there. So from October, there's been no failures to provide temporary accommodation, so I think it's really, really important. On the information on the ground, then our housing auctions hubs, which are all local authorities are a member of, and there are 5 throughout Scotland. What happened is they all had different frequencies of meeting before the pandemic. With the pandemic, we suggested, and they all took up the fact that they would meet more frequently, so we're meeting fortnightly, and that still goes on. And that's an immense source of us being able to get information out to all local authorities very, very quickly, and for local authorities to tell us what's happening in their own patches. So we know that some of the innovative things that some local authorities were doing in terms of like working with universities to get temp accommodation there, just because they had to cope with that increase was really, really important, and having different models. But one of the important things to remember from the housing option hubs is the fact that it's all about sharing experience. It's all about learning from each other. And it meant that we had a really, really good network, if you like, of people people in local authorities who are all struggling with the main challenges that were coming to them, having to cope in a completely different landscape. But they were able then to sort of like share their experience and learn from each other and be able to like respond quite innovatively at that point, which I think is really good. And the Minister mentioned the rapid rehousing transition plans. And local authorities are telling us that if they hadn't had the transition plans that were put to us in December 2018, and therefore they had a full year of implementation, that they wouldn't be in the place they are just now in terms of recovery. So although the figures in people in temp accommodation may look high, it's not because local authorities are not meeting their duties. In fact, it's showing the opposite of that they are meeting their duties, and they're really trying to like make sure that people are supported and kept safe and secure during this period of time. I think that probably covers most points for you, Minister.
I think it probably does. Thank you. Kevin, are you want back in? Minister, sorry.
I think that we've covered almost all bases there, but if there's anything we've missed, happy to come back.
Okay. Sarah, are you happy with that?
Yeah. National Temporary Accommodation Task Force, but I'll come back to that in my comments later if the Minister hasn't said anything.
Convener, if
just let Andy and Minister,
okay.
and you can respond. Right. Andy Wine.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Minister. It's 8 or 9 months since the original order in May 2020 came into force, and we're being invited to extend it again today. Could the Minister explain succinctly why homeless households should be paying the price for the failure to end the use of unsuitable temporary accommodation?
Convener, I would remind the committee that we actually brought in the change in May early because we were not going to do that, bring that in until the tail end of this Parliament. But what I wanted to do, and I think it's right, was to make sure that as we moved out of this pandemic, that new structure would become the norm. And I think that that is extremely important. And when we laid all of that in May, I hoped then that what we have now would not have been necessary. Because, you know, I hoped, as others did, you know, that we would be over the worst of the pandemic period by this time. But that's not the case. And we have to react to what is going on out there. There are real practical, very real practical challenges which have arisen in all areas as a result of COVID-19. And the decision here to extend the legislation is a direct and continuing response to those challenges. My priority, the government's priority, the priority of those folks in local authorities and in the front line at this point is to ensure that people are safe and to respond to the various health, the social and economic harms arising as best as we possibly can. And, you know, that's why in all of this, I have spoken continuously throughout all of this to the front line. I've been involved in the housing options hubs meetings to hear firsthand what folk are saying and what is possible and what is not. And we're not out of the woods yet in terms of all of this, and we should still allow that flexibility. I would reiterate the point that I made earlier to yourself, Convener, around about we may shift folk on. It may not be right for them at that particular moment in time because not everything is necessarily in place. And I have to take cognizance of what the folks themselves are saying and what frontline people are saying. And, you know, that is why I am asking for this extension. That's backed by local authorities. You know, it's backed by folk in the front line. And I think the committee must understand that there are still major pressures on out there caused by the pandemic period. And our first priority is to keep as safe as we possibly can.
Thank you. Can I challenge the notion that the people you've spoken to on the front line regard this as somehow of some utility? Shelter have told us that feedback they're getting and the services they provide have seen cases of individuals being stuck in temporary accommodation for significant lengths of time and suffering what they describe as brutal, horrendous and soul-destroying experiences. Have you experienced that from your discussions with people on the front line?
Officials talk to Shelter on a regular basis, and we have asked for examples of all of this because I would follow all of this up if that were the case. I do not have any examples from Shelter. What I do have from discussions with frontline folks is actual experiences of what is happening out there. Now, I'm more than happy to look at what Shelter are saying and to follow up and investigate anything that comes to their attention, as I would do for anyone else. Give us the examples of where it's not going right. We will investigate and try and resolve. But I cannot resolve things if I do not know what the actual difficulty is.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Convener, if you wouldn't mind, just a quick question about the rights of families and pregnant women to suitable temporary accommodation. Is that being fully met?
My expectation is that local authorities should ensure that pregnant women and families with children are suitably accommodated. That is essential, and you know, from what I am seeing, we are doing well on that front. I'll bring in Ms Gibbs in case there's any recent data that I have not seen on that. But you know, my expectation is that pregnant women and families with children should be in mainstream temporary accommodation. Ms Gibbs?
The unsuitable accommodation order still applies to pregnant women and families with children. So the normal rule that's been in place since 2014, when we changed it from 14 to 7 days, is there. So if a local authority has a household with children or a pregnant woman in it, and it's over 7 days, then they will be in breach of the order. And we know that local authorities try very, very hard to get people moved on from unsuitable accommodation in those instances as quickly as possible. So it may be that during an emergency, an out of hours type thing, and bed and breakfast is about the only solution that local authorities can use, but then they would seek to move people out as quickly as possible. And we know that in Edinburgh, where they were having the most struggle in this, they've definitely moved people out of unsuitable temporary accommodation as quickly as they possibly can, and really minimising the breaches. Thanks, Minister.
Okay. Is that you, Minister?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The committee will now consider the motion in the name of Andy Whiteman, S5M 23878. asking this committee to recommend that the Homeless Persons Unsuitable Accommodation Scotland Modification and Revocation Coronavirus Order 2021, SSI 2021-10 be annulled. Andy Whiteman will first speak to and move the motion, then an opportunity for each member to contribute to the debate if they wish. Andy.
Thanks very much, Convener, and I move the motion in my name. There have been 2 extensions of this temporary exemptions to the Homeless Persons Unsuitable Accommodation Scotland Order, first to the 30th of September 2020, then to 31st January 2021, and now this instrument extends it for a further period of exceptions to be in place until 30th June 2021. There's been plenty of time to ensure that arrangements can be put in place to ensure that the use of unsuitable temporary accommodation is no longer a lawful response to homelessness during the pandemic. The Minister said that some homeless people prefer B&B or hotels as mainstream housing is not ready, but that is no reason to deny them the legal right not to be housed in unsuitable temporary accommodation. Neither is that a reason as to why homeless people should be paying the price of the failure of government to provide, to ensure that homeless people have their legal right to suitable temporary accommodation. On 23rd September 2020, the Minister told this committee that he had asked local authorities and registered social landlords to ensure that 80 to 90% of housing allocations be made to homeless people. According to the most recent Scottish Housing Regulator statistics, on average only 39% of allocations are going to homeless households. Convener, the promise that was made in May 2020 should now be honoured, and a pledge brought into force that the full unsuitable accommodation order be in force at the very latest by the end of this Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does Sarah, you would like to come in?
Yes, thanks, Convener. I very much agree with the comments that Andy Whiteman has just made, because it is a horrendous experience for people to have to go through. I think we are in a very difficult position, and I won't be supporting Andy today in his proposal, but that doesn't mean that I don't agree with a lot of what he said. In my view, this fundamentally comes down to a lack of suitable housing and vulnerability that I think has been exacerbated by the pandemic. So I think we need to keep the pressure up, support local authorities and third sector organisations, homeless organisations, so that people who are homeless don't just get accommodation, but they get the wraparound support that is absolutely essential in normal times, never mind during the pandemic. But I want to highlight the point about prevention of homelessness, because I think that needs to be given priority. If we're seeing more people become homeless, we know that there is support for renters at the moment, but people are building up debts week by week, and there's an issue that's going to begin to impact on them going forward, because a lot of people have lost incomes. They're not going to be able to afford their rents, whether it's in the social or the private rented sector. And I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed now. We've got women who've experienced domestic violence. That's going up during the pandemic. So we do have an increasing growth of challenges, and we are basically not got enough housing to go around. So there's some specific issues mentioned in the report from local authorities that I'd like the Minister to comment on, about trying to prioritise addressing voids that need repairs, addressing existing empty homes, making sure that they are able to be reused. The experience in Edinburgh of trying to access short-term lets and converting them into long-term tenancies. So bringing back properties into homes use. But I think there's an issue. If we've got 14,000 households in temporary accommodation, then we're rationing the housing available. And I can name constituents who are living in inappropriate private rented accommodation that's too small for them, a family of 4 in 1 bedroom. They are now more vulnerable than ever. So we need to support people who are currently homeless. We need to tackle the prevention of homelessness now and through the next few months of this pandemic, because that's going to be more of a challenge because of the economic and social pressure people are under. And fundamentally, we need to find a way to ramp up new additional housing being added to the stock, so that we actually take the pressure off people who are homeless and are not getting the accommodation that they need. So they would be the key things I hope the Minister will address in his comments to us. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. And Keith, I see you want to come in.
Thanks, Convener. Just to say that I don't agree with Andy Whiteman's position. I think he doesn't seem to accept the fact that local authorities have either responsibilities or views on this order, responsibilities in relation to how they manage the current very particular circumstances, or the views of some people that are at the centre of this as well, who are receiving these temporary accommodation solutions. So I don't agree with the annulment, but I do think at the root of it is, as has been said by the last two speakers, the supply of good quality social housing. Although it's almost as if it had not been the case for decades, councils were obliged to sell off their social housing and additional housing was not built to replace it. And this government, the government that's currently in office in Scotland's done a great deal to massively expand social housing and other housing, but they can only do that within the resources. I do think at the root, the use of resources on temporary accommodation is uneconomic. I realise it's essential. There's no other way to deal with that, but I would far rather see sometimes the exorbitant costs of temporary accommodation being put towards a major house building, further house building programme. I think that is at the root. If you can have the right supply, then that's where we get to. But the government's doing a great deal in that respect. It's also trying to cope with the pandemic, as our councils and as our suppliers. And I would support the order put forward by the Minister and will be against the annulment.
Thank you very much. Minister, would you like to contribute?
Convener, if I may, thank you. And I agree with a lot of what has been said already by Ms Boyack and by Mr. Without doubt, vulnerability, as Ms Boyack has said, has been exacerbated by COVID. And we all have a duty to ensure that we do our level best for folk now and as we move forward. But Convener, we have managed to do a great deal in partnership with local authorities and with third sector organisations during the course of this pandemic period. We have managed to get folk off the streets. Rough sleeping is very, very low in Scotland at this moment in time. There are 2 cases as of last week in Glasgow. Third sector organisations are doing their level best to try and get those folks in. But that is a huge, huge difference from what we had previously. But in order to keep folk in, we have to listen to them and to meet their needs. And their needs may not necessarily be met in mainstream accommodation at this moment. And I think in all of this, it's my duty, and I think the duty of all of us, to listen to the front line around about what is required in that regard. Mr Brown talked about the government and its delivery of affordable homes since it came to power in 2007. And of course, Mr Brown played his part in ensuring that there were more affordable and social homes in Scotland. And this government will continue to see housing as a priority. But what is not helpful is the fact that we have just recently lost £218 million in housing consequentials from the UK government, and a 66.5% cut in financial transactions, which has a major impact on our delivery of affordable homes as we move forward. And I hope that everyone in the committee would be supportive of the government's aim to get the UK government to reverse those decisions. Ms Boyack pointed out a number of factors that have been exacerbated during the course of the pandemic. Domestic violence being one that she mentioned. And again, you know, we have a duty to ensure that we do the best for people who are fleeing such circumstances. And the new legislation which has been introduced in Parliament should be helpful in that regard. And the other thing which I think is important is looking at the stock, as has been mentioned, and not just dealing with this in the same old ways. And one of the things that we have ongoing at this moment in time in Edinburgh is a pilot in the PRS, which is being run by the Cyrenians, Crisis and Streetwork, to utilise good private rented stock, some of which has been empty at this moment, and get folk into suitable homes in that regard. And I am more than happy to look at any suggestions that are put forward in these kind of regards and move forward on that front. Again, I want to pay tribute to the front line because many other things happened during the course of the pandemic. We've seen a prisoner release programme, which I'll be honest with you, caused me some worry about how that may pan out. And yet the front line, the councils, the third sector organisations managed to cope and to deal with and ensure that folks were accommodated appropriately. Also, what we have seen, as I mentioned previously, is greater cohesion in terms of agencies working together to do what is right for people. And the most important thing for me in all of this is that folk have actually been listening to those people who are our most vulnerable and have been doing the right things in terms of moving folk on when the time is right for that. Finally, convener, I think Ms. Boyack and again Mr. Brown mentioned support for renters. Now we have got a package of measures in place at this moment in time to support renters, but we all know that there are going to be strains on folk as we move forward. And that's why I think the furlough scheme has got to continue. It's why the UK government should not cut universal credit, as it looks likely that they will do. And beyond that, I think that the Chancellor of the Exchequer should be looking more at what needs to be done for renters across these islands. Because at the end of the day, this Parliament does not control housing benefit. It does not control the benefit system. And we need to find a way to stop crisis in the future. So stop cutting our affordable housing money in your budgets. Don't cut universal credit. Don't get rid of the furlough. And let's look for a solution right across these islands. Take a cognizance of the real difficulties that folk find themselves in and find a solution for those folks who have had difficult times during the course of this pandemic. Finally, convener, I would ask the committee to vote against Andy Whiteman's annulment motion, as that would be extremely damaging for some of our most vulnerable people at this time.
Thank you very much. And I now invite Andy Whiteman to respond to the debate and press or withdraw S5M 23878.
Thanks, convener. I press the motion. I'll be very brief, time's pressing. I accept that local authorities have the view they have. I accept that the Minister has the view he has. The question as to whether homeless people should have the right not to be housed in unsuitable temporary accommodation is not a question as to the views of local government or central government, or indeed those organisations on the front line. It's a matter of what the law should say, and they should have the legal right not to be housed in unsuitable temporary accommodation. And so I'm moving this motion to annul the order in order to secure the legal rights of homeless people not to be accommodated in unsuitable accommodation. Thank you, convener.
Thank you very much, Andy. Therefore, the question is that motion S5M 23878 in the name of Andy Whiteman be agreed to. Are we all agreed? I'm taking it, given that Andy will be opposing it. Okay. We are not agreed, so there must be a division. Please do this by, we'll do this alphabetically. Sarah Boyack. You're muted, Sarah.
Thank you, Convener. I don't support the annulment.
Thank you. Jeremy Balfour.
No, Convener.
Yeah. Keith Brown.
Against the annulment, Convener.
Thank you. Gordon MacDonald.
Against the annulment.
Thank you. Alexander Stewart.
Against the annulment, Convener.
Andy Whiteman is for it.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. And myself is against it. Okay. That means 6 against and 1 for. Therefore, the annulment falls. Committee has agreed not to recommend to Parliament that the instrument be annulled and has made no recommendation to Parliament in respect of the instrument. The committee will report on this instrument in due course, and I invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. And I now thank the Minister and his official for taking part in this meeting. I will suspend briefly to allow a witness changeover.
Thank you.
At agenda item 6, the committee is taking evidence from local government representatives on the financial settlement for local government as set out in the Scottish Government's budget 2021-22. Today, I welcome Councillor Gail McGregor, Resources Spokesperson COSLA, Martin Booth, Executive Director of Finance, City of Glasgow Council, Eileen Rowan, Director of Finance, Fife Council, and Sarah Waters, Chief Officer Finance, COSLA. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your written submission. For information, we've allocated around 70 minutes for this session. And some brief technical information before we start. There's a pre-arranged questioning order, and I will call each member in turn to ask their questions for up to 9 minutes. It would help broadcasting if members could indicate who in the panel their questions are addressed to. As there are 4 panellists, please indicate clearly if you wish to answer the question, for instance, by raising your hand. And don't feel the need to answer every question if the views are generally in line with points already made. Please could everyone give broadcasting staff a second to operate your microphones before you speak. Thank you very much for that, and we will now move on to questions. I will begin by asking, excuse me 1 second. So, Sarah Boyack to come in first, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener. Can I just say thank you to all the witnesses for the evidence they've submitted in advance of today's session. That's been incredibly useful. I had a couple of initial questions I wanted in relation to just clarifying some of the figures. I'd be very keen to get a clarity on the issue about the extent to which witnesses think that we have non-ring fence funding, and if you could identify some of the service pressures that are particularly concerning both as we're in the pandemic and thinking of what happens afterwards. So that's the issue of services that are non-ring fenced that I know are vulnerable to cuts. And I would also like to ask the witnesses about the proposal we've heard from the Cabinet Secretary to freeze council tax and the financial implications of that for individual local authorities, and just what their view is on the principle of that, given it's a local authority funding issue. Thank you, Convener. Maybe kick off by asking Gail McGregor to lead in the answers, and then let the other witnesses add any comments that they have to the questions I've asked.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Sarah. I will defer to Sarah a bit more on specifics on the ring fencing, but certainly within the last few years, we've seen a significant shift from funding that can be used locally and with local decision making to funding that is very much ring fenced. And I think this year is another prime example. On the surface, the overall budget looked as if it was up about £500 million, which seemed to be very welcome. But once you start to cut down into that additional £500 million, 160 million of it again is ring fenced. And when you take out the COVID funding of 259, you're only left with 95 million additional in the core, which represents 0.9% of the budget. So obviously there's not been any significant uplift in our core budget, and a significant proportion again of this year's additionality is already allocated to ring fenced policy from Scottish Government. As I say, I'll let Sarah maybe go into a bit more detail around the ring fence very quickly on council tax, because I'm sure Martin will have a view on this. Leaders have been very consistent that council tax is a local tax and should be determined locally, and that they've maintained that position throughout. I think the challenge we have now is that there is £90 million on the table, which is being offered essentially as a compensation for us to freeze council tax. So I think the pressure will be on leaders to do that. I think in this current financial climate, leaders are very aware of household pressures and the pressure within communities and individual family budgets. And I very much doubt would have penalised households in the first instance. But obviously we're now being pushed down a route of having to freeze it and take the compensation, which to me is a bit of a political decision. I think the challenge we have with council tax is that if we don't raise the base this year, it keeps the base artificially lowered. And then as we go into next year, if that £90 million isn't baselined within the budget, it could potentially see us having to apply a much higher level of council tax, say double what we would have done this year, which when we're coming out of recovery from COVID would equally hit households. So I think our plea to government would be that 90 million must be baselined to ensure that our base continues as is and that we don't actually penalise households going forward. But as I say, I'll defer to Sarah on additional ring fence. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McGregor. Yes, and just to go back to Ms Boyack's question about the kind of non-ring fenced funding, I think the issue this year is probably going to be more acute in some of these areas because, as Councillor McGregor has quite rightly said, a lot of what was packaged as an uplift, the 335 million from Scottish Government, will go for particular purposes, which leaves about 94 million for dealing with the pressures that are already in the system. And I think that the key pressure points this year in relation to COVID and coming out the other side and recovery during 21-22 is in relation to things like economic development and employability services, support services, community learning and development and youth work. And I think these are services that over multiple years COSLA has highlighted are really the services that suffer when the core isn't funded properly. So, for example, the 94 million uplift, we know that will not cover the pressures that are already there around things like pay. Councillor McGregor is about to go into pay negotiations, so that will not. So then you have to take the money from somewhere, and that is the types of services that I've just quoted. I mean, the latest economic development figures available back in 18-19. Local authorities supported 15,000 unemployed people back into work. I can imagine that kind of support is going to be absolutely critical as we move into next year. But unfortunately, if we don't have enough funding to fund the core services, then those are the types of areas that will suffer. And we have good data on these services and the impacts over the years on their budgets.
Eileen, you said you'd like to come in?
Look at the kind of construct of the budget, and we obviously talk about ring fence funding, but there's also protected spending. So if you look at items such as the pupil-teacher ratio, if you look at the protection of teachers paying pensions, if you look at how we're giving money for social care, that there's conditions set on that, when we look at how much is protected, it's around about 60%, and in the past that was 40%, so it has risen. So what that means is it really puts a lot of pressures on our unprotected budget, and Sarah's highlighted some of these areas that are really important when we're trying to obviously recover the position. So there's big factors for local government to deal with, such as anti-poverty, economic recovery, community wealth building. So a reduction in core, once you take into account the pay policy, really does put pressure on local government.
Thank you. And Martin Booth, you wanted to come in?
Yep, thank you, Convener. And again, Councillor McGregor, Sarah and Eileen have covered most of the points. The point about the services that would be under pressure, and again, some of those have been covered, but probably the two biggest ones in Glasgow would be culture and leisure services and the importance of those as we recover. People's health and mental health have been under quite severe pressure during the pandemic, and we see that they're important services to help people to recover and get back to normal. And secondly, and again, I'm sure Councillor McGregor will confirm that local councillors' mailbags are busiest with issues around local services, neighbourhoods and sustainability services such as refuse collection and street cleaning. And again, that's the big service that's left after you take out the protection around social work and education spending. So these are the services that will suffer as a result of the increase in grant not being enough to even fund the public sector pay policy, never mind the demands from trade unions. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yeah, that's all very helpful. Just going back to the last point that was just made there by Martin about particular services like culture and leisure. One issue that I wanted to ask was the issue of the gap between income that would normally be expected and income you've actually been able to achieve during the pandemic, and to what extent have you been able to get compensation from the Scottish Government. My understanding is there's a pretty significant gap there. Can you clarify that? I don't know if Martin or Derek or Gail, I'm not sure who the best person is to clarify that issue.
I'm happy to start off on that one. So, both from Glasgow's point of view, but across Scotland, that lost income has been a significant element, and the lost income through culture and leisure services has been very significant. The funding that's been provided, even with the uplift as part of the Scottish budget statement, which lifted it from 90 million to 200 million, that's still significantly shy of the actual lost income figures for the first 6 months. So I think from memory, the figure for the first 6 months of the year was 227 million. So there's still a 27 million gap with another 6 months still to come. In Glasgow's case, just on leisure, culture and leisure services, their lost income was £38 million. And that's not income that will recover quickly. It won't recover from the 1st of April or from the first day after unlock. We're anticipating that will take several years for that to fully recover, although hopefully as quickly as possible.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Can I just ask a question? And see, before I ask my questions, can I just ask that everybody doesn't have to answer every question? We have got a lot to get through, and I know that everybody will have an opinion on the questions that have been asked, but if it's already been answered, please don't feel that you have to answer it as well. Can I ask, what evidence is there that the local authorities' priorities are not the same as the Scottish Government's when it comes to these ring-fence grants, the bulk of which relate to the expansion of early learning and childcare as well as pupil equity? And I think, Gail, you want to come on this one?
Yeah, thanks very much. And again, Sarah might want to comment on this. I think we've acknowledged in the past, and certainly at this committee, that a huge amount of the policies have been developed with COSLA. I would take early learning and childcare as an example. But I think over and above that, we end up with lots and lots of very small ring-fenced pots of money that don't always align across the 32 local authorities. And I think that at times it would be better if we were given that money and allowed to make local decisions for all the very many little ring-fenced pots. And that's what we're in discussion with government around at the moment. The 259 million of COVID funding doesn't seem to have the same restrictions on it as has been applied over the past few months, and that's very much welcome because that will enable councils to make very local decisions. So while we work in partnership with the government on a regular basis to develop policies, there are times when we're not always fully consulted, and then we have a fairly high level announcement and it doesn't always align with the individual priorities of 32 councils, and trying to weigh up that rural and urban demographic as well, because as you'll appreciate, not one size fits all. But Sarah might wish to come in on that as well.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor McGregor. Yes, I think in relation to things like pupil equity funding, absolutely, you know, there's no way that local government wouldn't agree with that policy intent, but I think it's the kind of scaffolding that goes around these types of services that are absolutely necessary. There's, I think, a feeling really that the kind of ring-fence nature of the likes of pupil equity funding means that the services that sit around that can't really be utilised to best effect because they're part of the services that we're having to make cuts in. And pupil equity funding is very much classroom focused, which, you know, there is a place for that, but there's also a place for the kind of scaffolding of support services that sit around that, the children's social work services, the youth work services, the things that actually can add the value out with the classroom and make a difference to the attainment gap.
Can I ask just on the pupil equity fund? When I was convener of the Education Committee, there seemed to be, and we did some visits, seemed to be a great deal of flexibility about how schools use that. Does that differ from local authority area to local authority area?
I think, yeah, it is used differently, but I think there are restrictions around it in terms of how far it can go in terms of that I guess it's thinking about, a child as part of a family, and there's family support that might be required. So, to get the most from equity, I mean, to get the most from this fund, it is used differently in local authorities, but there are still very kind of strict conditions and reporting requirements that come with that. So I don't think it's as flexible as some local authorities would like to see it in relation to family support and support out with the classroom.
Okay, thank you. Martin?
Thanks, Convener. As the number of your question was, were we broadly aligned policy-wise on these ring-fence funds? And I think the broad answer to that is yes. I think the real challenge comes where we agree with our policy intent and there's funding provided for that, but there's cut to our core budget, which means we can't support the base. So, as an example, Councillor McGregor mentioned the early learning and childcare expansion to 1140 hours. So they funded the expansion to the 1140 hours, but they didn't protect the budget for the core 600 hours that was already in there. So we're facing cuts in our core, and then they fund a bit on top. So those two things don't align. We have to have our core protected first, and then have expansion. If you don't protect the core, then you undermine the foundations of that policy.
I'm not sure about what exactly you mean there. I mean, if you've been funded for the 600+ hours the previous years, that funding will still be there, no?
Well, but we've had real-term cuts in our funding. So last year we had a cut in funding. This year we've got a very small increase, which we're appreciative of an increase, but it's still lower than our core costs will go up. So pay inflation, based on the public sector pay policy, will be round about 2%, just over 2%. The growth in funding is less than 1%. So that has to come from somewhere. So if you take early learning and childcare as a grouping, which will have probably north of 2% as a pay pressure, then the 600 hours that's in the core budget isn't protected. So we have to make savings to balance our budget, and then they put on top. So it's they're expanding, funding the expansion, but we're not getting enough resources to protect the core.
So really, it's about the decisions you make with the money you've got. But because what you're really saying here is that you don't have the option of cutting the 1140 hours, the funding for that, to use elsewhere.
Yes, so we're having to cut elsewhere to implement a policy. So in reality, the policy has not really been fully funded.
Okay, but the issue is that you decide if you would like the option to be able to decide if you want to continue to fund that or if you want to fund something else with the budget you get.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Jeremy, would you like to come in now?
Thank you, Convener. Just a couple of questions. Firstly, obviously we're talking a lot about revenue budget, but I think the capital budget, from what I can see, hasn't gone up at all. I just wonder what effect will that have on local authorities, and longer term, particularly, what effect will that have? And I'm happy to give that to whoever wants it.
Sorry,
Okay.
Gail.
Gail, can you start?
Muted. Sorry, Convener, would it be easier if you ask me who would be best to answer, and then I can flag it to whoever I think's best, and that might be Stephen.
That's how we've done it in the past.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, Jeremy, thank you. Yes, the capital budget hasn't increased, and we now have the 5-year plan, which was announced last week, which sees our capital budget basically flatlining for the next 5 years. I will defer to Sarah to give you some examples of the impact that will have on councils. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what we've highlighted within our submission was the kind of interrelationship between capital and revenue as well. So the ability to borrow, for example, is impacted by our revenue funding. But actually, I think what I'll do is bring Eileen into to answer this, if that's okay.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, so if you look at the capital that's came to local government in the last few years, it's kind of varied. There's been money for specific items such as early years. But if you go to the Audit Scotland report, that suggests there's a significant real terms reduction in capital. And it also highlights that councils are having to borrow more. So our net debt's gone up by 4% in 1920. And that really puts into context the affordability of us being able to invest in our existing assets and make sure that they're fit for purpose, but also to invest in new assets in order to deliver on the outcomes that are required. So as Sarah said, it's really important that there's a level of capital that allows us to do that, to meet life cycle costs and have assets that are fit for purpose. So we believe that looking at our finances going forward, we would hope that there would be an increase in capital, but we understand that's got to be within the overall resources at the Scottish Government's disposal, because we are seeing pressures in the system at the moment on our borrowing costs.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. If I can change tack to another area, and that is in regard to those councils who have a growing population, particularly within my region, Mid Lothian, Edinburgh and East Lothian. How do you think the budget reflects that type of pressure, where you have a local authority area that has an increasing number of people coming to live in it, and also a number of services, particularly around schools, that need to be funded? Does the budget take that into account? And if not, how do you think that can be dealt with?
Yeah.
Thank you again, Jeremy. I think population is an issue, and at the moment, as the budget sits, it doesn't take particular regard to rising population within areas such as East Lothian, and I'm very aware that there is an issue in that area. I think one of the things that we have to do as we're going forward, and obviously COVID has slightly halted that work, is to pick up the work around the fiscal framework, which we were doing at pace prior to COVID, and the key thing now is to pick that piece of work back up probably after the Scottish parliamentary election in May, and begin to look at a lot of medium to long term structure for local government funding, hopefully looking at multi-year funding, and then perhaps looking at the distribution models that we currently use, and the process that we use to determine, because clearly we do have pockets within Scotland where we're seeing a sharp increase of population, and within an awful lot of our distribution at the moment that isn't fully accounted for. So I appreciate the pressures in those areas. So I think the key thing is that we have to pick up that fiscal framework and make sure that we have a framework that is absolutely fit for purpose going forward and serves all 32 local authorities as it should do.
Okay, thank you, Gail, that's helpful. And then my just final question is to go back to, I think, a point that you made originally in your opening statement, and that's in regard to what happens in the next financial year if council tax is frozen for this year. You gave a wee bit of information, but I just wonder, could you maybe just give us some kind of figures around what that would look like in regard to a council tax increase if this wasn't met next year by Scottish Government? What kind of increases we'll be looking at in council tax increases?
Mm-hmm. That's a very difficult one to answer, because as you'll appreciate, each individual council will make its own decisions in respect to council tax next year, assuming that that £90 million isn't baselined. I think Martin probably has some really good examples of the impact that a freeze on council tax had the first time around. So it might be helpful to bring Martin in at this point.
Thank you, Councillor McGregor. So council tax was frozen several years ago, from memory, for 3 years. And at that time, it was about £70 million a year, which was baselined, but not until the following year. So that makes it much more difficult from a planning point of view. But if that £90 million going forward wasn't to be baselined, then the approximately 3% that represents would have to be funded before we started whatever the pressures were for next year. So it would be a kind of starting point of at least 3% on a standstill budget. We've not had a standstill budget for a very long time. I think it's worth pointing out that the council tax is a relatively small percentage of a council's total budget. That varies quite a lot between authorities. In Glasgow, it's about 14%. So if, for example, we have to fund a 1% pay rise with council tax, that equates to about a 5% rise in council tax. So the example that we've given earlier, where the difference between the public sector pay policy in Scotland and the increase in our core resources, if that was all to be funded from council tax, that would be equivalent to about a 6% increase. But it's too dependent on too many other factors to give a more accurate answer than that.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Keith?
Thanks, Convener. I think for most of us on the committee, most of us are ex-councillors or council employees, and in some cases both. I think we're all quite keen to find out what's a fair and equitable, whether the proposed budget is fair and equitable to local authorities, and we all accept the pressure. I think the information we have is about a 2.4% real terms reduction in revenue since 2014-15, I think it was. But it's trying to work out whether that's fair given the resources that are available to the Scottish Government. And seeing in the evidence that COSLA gave to the Finance Committee that they compared the situation in Scotland unfavourably with that in England. In fact, it mentions COSLA talking about tranches of money from central government to help them address problems. I just wonder, that kind of jars with information I get from colleagues down south where you've got councils going bankrupt and talk of 60% cuts. I just wonder if the COSLA representatives could give us some more indication on the comparative situation that they've referred to between Scotland and England, or indeed other parts of the UK.
Again, probably better to bring Sarah in here because she deals with the LGA and the other associations across the UK.
Right, on you go.
So I think the comparisons that we were making in the submission were in relation to specifically in relation to the COVID-related funding. So this was the way in which COVID consequentials were flowing through to local government. We're aware that both in England and Wales, the local authorities were allocated very big kind of tranches of, I think 4 tranches of funding, which were awarded on a flexible basis. And that was kind of what I think the LGA have termed kind of general purpose funding, the type of funding that councils need to pay the overtime, the extra vehicles, all the additional cleaning costs, all the extra costs that are in the system due to COVID. I think the situation in Scotland has been different. We had 1 or 2 tranches of general purpose funding early on in the pandemic, but after that it's been over 30 separate pots of funding for specific purposes, which has put a lot of pressure not just on Scottish Government officials but on local government 32 times over as those grants make their way down into local government. And actually what we have welcomed over recent weeks is a move by officials to actually look at some of these grants and actually look where they can put that into general revenue funding, which is to be welcomed, because actually that then gives us the flexibility that if there's a bit of money left in a pot over here, it can be used to respond to some local need over there. So for example, we had 2 funds, one doing community food fund, one doing school meals fund, and there was little flexibility between the 2. If it's part of general revenue fund and there's an issue with family food but not school food, you can respond accordingly. So I think that was the comparison that we'd made in our submission, that really we would have preferred large tranches of undirected general purpose funding as opposed to over 30 pots of specific grant for specific purpose.
That wasn't really my question. My question was about the general situation. I mentioned 2.4% that's said to be cut since 2014-15, and the general funding situation for councils in England, where you've seen councils going bust. So it's about the general comparison between Scotland and England rather than specifically in relation to COVID. I just wondered what COSLA could tell us about that.
I think I've answered this previously, and I think it's very difficult to make comparisons because the councils in England have different structures and different responsibilities from Scotland. I can only speak on behalf of Scotland, I think for us, the challenge is that we've seen an increase in the Scottish Government budget, as you say. It's risen by over 3% in the last 7 years, but our budget has decreased by over 2%, and that represents challenges in of itself. So I think my key focus is ensuring that local councils in Scotland have sufficient core funding to continue to deliver the services within social care and education and communities, as you're aware. But we also need to be assured that all additional policy commitments are fully funded, and not just fully funded, but if they are moving forward, that they must be baselined into core budgets as well. COVID funding requires to be fully funded. At the moment, we have an allocation of 259 million. We don't know where that figure has come from. It's only a projection at this stage. But if we require additional funding going forward into the next financial year, I will expect to have a conversation with the Cabinet Secretary to ensure that that happens. Over and above that, one of the biggest challenges we have at the moment, which was mentioned briefly earlier, is loss of income. And we know that we do have a £220 million-ish shortfall simply for this financial year, but we also know that community services and leisure services are not going to reopen anytime soon. That pressure is going to continue into next year. So I think the key thing for us is ensuring that, coming from a fairly weak base from a number of years where we've had a reduction in our core budgets, that going forward that budget is protected and that the additionality is covered. And that will enable us to do exactly what we've done for the last 10, 11 months, deliver the key services that we always do, but actually pick up the baton run and really, really help our communities in a very difficult time. And that's before we even get into recovery.
Thanks, Kate. I think for those of us that want to try and be supportive of local government in relation to this, simply picking an example that suits from down south and professing ignorance of everything to do with the general situation is not helpful, and it might be useful for the committee separately to get comparative information with England and Wales if COSLA don't have that. But if it's the position of COSLA that local government presumably has been unfairly treated because they've had a reduction, and the allegation made just now, which I'm not sure can be substantiated, that the Scottish Government's income has gone up, where is it COSLA thinks that the money is going from the Scottish Government that should be coming to local government? For example, as far as I'm aware, in the last 5 years, in fact even longer, there's been no amendment by any other party in the Parliament to say money should come from elsewhere to go to local government. So where is that extra money, this bounty, going in the view of COSLA that should be coming to COSLA or local government?
The figures that I've quoted were those that have been produced by SPICE in a recent briefing, but I'll bring Sarah in on this point.
Actually, Eileen would like to come in on this, if that's okay. As Councillor McGregor says, yes, we were quoting the SPICE figures within the submission.
Okay, so if I just look at the wider question that's been asked, I actually meet with directors of finance in England and Wales as part of my chair of Scottish Directors of Finance, and it's quite evident from them that the funding that they've received in year for COVID and their concerns about the budget going forward for this coming financial year are more optimistic than Scotland. And the work that Audit Scotland have done in the overview report have indicated that 60 to 70% funding has been provided by the government for the COVID costs. So there's still quite a bit of way to go, and there's a number of councils that are struggling. Now, I'm aware that there's councils struggling down south as well, and been in discussions with SIPFA about that. But part of that is due to some of their commercial decisions that they've taken in the past. So it is different. So I think it is important to get more evidence on that. I think what I would say about where should the funding come from, I think it's about the relative increases to different parts of the Scottish budget. So if you look at what's happened with health and sport and compare that to local government, it's quite significantly different. And I think what we would call for within local government is to, I suppose, an appreciation of the role that we play and the importance on improving such things as health and well-being. So if we are to improve the health of the nation, there's really important things that local government play a role in. And I suppose it's looking at the consequentials that come to health and looking at if there can be wider use of these. And I think that probably is in agreement with the medium-term financial strategy that the government has and the aspirations there. So what we're asking for is that to be followed through in the budget.
Thanks, Kevin. My last question really, sorry, My last question really was, I've got a lot of sympathy with that last point that's been made about the better use between local authorities and health boards of the money that goes to health. But the last point really is about the multi-year nature of what local government would like to see, indicative budgets for multi-years, and the Scottish Government is saying, well, no, we get no information from the UK Government. I mean, their budget's not even going to be set until after local authority budgets. Do you think there's more the Scottish Government could do, despite the fact it doesn't know what it's getting, to give more indications to councils for future years? Again, for COSLA.
Gail?
Sorry, a bit of a delay in my phone kicking in there. As I say, we're having discussions about the fiscal framework and longer term budgets now, and I think we do have to do that. I completely sympathise that we don't always get the clarity in multi-year budgets from the UK Government to assist the Scottish Government, but there are parts of our budgets that could perhaps be given a longer term projection on, and I think certainly around IJBs and health and social care funding, that would be an element of work that happens within councils that we could look for a bit more sustainability on. We did start to have discussions on that previously, but again, they were put in abeyance. We're now seeing a 5-year capital plan, and it's quite an ambitious plan for Scottish Government. So I think if they can do a 5-year capital plan for the period of the next Parliament, that it's not inconceivable that they could give us a little bit more certainty. And I think the reality is that the sooner councils know what they can be projecting to spend, the easier it is for us to make decisions, and particularly long-term investment in capital and sustained services within the sort of revenue sector as well. So I think any certainty is better than none, but that has to form part of the fiscal framework.
Okay, right. Okay, thanks, Keith. Andy?
Thanks very much, Convener, and welcome, guests. Can I just follow that answer that Gail McGregor gave to ask you, Gail, what progress is being made on the development of the fiscal framework? Where are talks, and what elements, if any, have been agreed, what remains to be agreed, and what's the timescale?
Thanks, Andy. As you know, we were engaged in fiscal framework work prior to COVID, and I have to say it's been completely put in abeyance since last sort of February, March. It hasn't picked back up again. I think there's probably an aspiration to do that fairly quickly after the May election, but obviously, given the crisis situation we've been in, there's been other work to focus on. COSLA has released its local government blueprint in the last few months, which I think gives a very clear aspiration for where we would like to see local government over the next few years, as I say, a sort of medium to long-term plan. What we need to do is pick up those discussions with government at the earliest opportunity. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add on that. Sorry, the sun's shining on me.
No? Okay, Andy? Oh, sorry, Sarah.
Yeah, just to reiterate what Councillor McGregor said, yeah, we'd got to have a good position with our leaders. We had agreement on scope, and we had shared that with Scottish Government. I think it's fair to say that on the local governance review in its entirety, there hasn't been a huge amount of progress lately. We are doing some work now that we have a little bit of capacity that's not dealing with the kind of huge amounts of COVID funding and the different grants and things. We're looking more now at local taxation and the innovative financing elements of the fiscal framework again. It's very challenging, especially given what we've come through, the risks that COVID has thrown into the mix and really shone a light on them. So we've got to be very cognizant of that as we go forward. But absolutely, our members want us to pick this back up, but they absolutely recognise the capacity at the moment. But we are starting to do some preliminary work again.
Thank you very much. And to move on, Gail, can you tell me what impact the reduction in the non-domestic rate, proposed reduction in the non-domestic rate poundage by 0.8 pence will have on the local government settlement? Can you tell me whether you were consulted about that proposal? And can you tell me whether there have been any further conversations between COSLA and the Scottish Government about handing back rate setting powers for non-domestic rates?
I personally haven't had any discussions, and I'll defer to Martin on that.
Okay, thank you, Councillor McGregor. Thank you, Mr. Whiteman. The reduction in the rate changes will make a fairly small saving for councils for the rates that they pay. So that's a small positive for Glasgow. That's a few £100,000. But on our overall settlement, it doesn't really have any impact, because the rates we collect are netted off our settlement from Scottish Government. So the risk of that sits in the Scottish Government's budget, not in local government's budget. So other than the small benefit from the rates that we pay ourselves, it doesn't impact.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I just want to touch again on the question of longer-term financial planning, because Audit Scotland have found, and I quote, that long-term financial planning is not well enough developed in many councils. Does COSLA agree with that? And what steps are being taken to ensure that longer-term financial planning is better developed?
Sorry, Andy, I suspect that Eileen would probably want to come in on this one.
Yes, thank you. I think longer term financial planning is really important, and it's certainly something that we as Directors of Finance strive to do. So many councils have revenue plans looking 5 years ahead. We obviously have to make assumptions within there, because obviously we don't know items such as grant and pay, but I think we've got to look at things like changing demographics and how we plan to respond to that. So I think councils are in different places, and what I would say is that it's been improving. Certainly within Fife we have a 10-year capital plan, and we look ahead for 3 years for our revenue budget. So it's obviously difficult to have solutions going out, say for your revenue budget in 2 or 3 years' time, but we certainly can have planning assumptions, and I think it's something that we need to do going forward. And going back to the point about obviously Scottish Government face the same issues with their long-term financial planning as well, and the report that's been published lately where we have more clarity on the capital aspirations, we'd be asking for more clarity on the revenue aspirations.
Okay, thank you very much, Convener. That's enough from me just now, unless Sarah Waters wants to come back, and I see her on this.
Yeah, it was just to make a point about the kind of longer term financial planning also involves a huge, in most councils, a huge transformation programme. And those transformation programmes have obviously been impacted this year. And the savings that those transformation programmes were hoping to release in year. So some of the pressures that councils are facing are as a result of those savings not being released this year and then on a recurring basis. So I think that, as Eileen said, absolutely councils are looking to long-term financial planning, but there's so, COVID has caused so much instability, and I think, transformation planning is a key part of that, is having to be transformed, I think, as we speak this year, to cope with the situation that we find ourselves in, and the situation that Martin articulated about, things like leisure services not recovering, into next year, the year after, and potentially the year after that.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks.
Right, thank you, Andy. Gordon?
Thanks very much, Convener. Before I ask my own questions, I wanted to go back to the point that Jeremy Balfour was raising about capital expenditure. I'm not sure if I picked the witnesses up correctly, but looking at the Audit Scotland report that was published last month for the last financial year, under key messages it says, councils had the highest level of capital expenditure of the last 5 years. So is that a correct position, that it was substantially higher than previous years in 2019-20?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, I think just before Eileen comes in, I think if you look at the settlement over the last, well, we certainly look back to 13-14. If you look back, the year 1920 was one of the highest years in terms of the capital settlement. That not least because there were things like early years put into that. So as the early years expansion programme goes on, that has put additional capital into local government budgets. So 1920 was a year of particularly high capital settlement, and then the activity in relation to the early years expansion would have contributed to that, as well as ongoing schools building programmes at the end of the last programme. But Eileen might want to add to that.
I think I covered in a previous answer. I've got the Audit Scotland report in front of me, and if you look at the capital funding between 13-14 and 2021, it's really jumped about a lot. So between 1920 and 2021, I think there's a 30% reduction in funding, but that's really because of investment in things like expansion of 114 hours. So it's specific items that have been funded. So it has changed significantly over the last 6 years. It's not been a smooth line. But what I would say is that we are seeing councils borrowing increasing, and we're seeing more pressure to maintain our assets and meet life cycle costs. So it is a real challenge. And at the same time, if our budget's under pressure.
In terms of capital budget, the Audit Scotland report is quite plain. It says under point 6, councils had the highest level of capital expenditure of the last 5 years at 3.6 billion. Now, looking back to the Audit Scotland report of 2006-07, the council, the capital expenditure budget was 1.9 billion. So we have seen a substantial amount of capital expenditure to councils, whether it's to supply what you've said about early years, whether it's about upgrading the council's housing stock, which we're now building substantially more than before, or whether it's the increase in schools that are now in good or satisfactory condition because of the investment. The reality is that councils have had substantial amounts of capital expenditure over the last 14 years.
And I wouldn't disagree with that, because it has increased in specific years to do specific new things, such as early years. But what I suppose I'm flagging is that going forward, it has dropped in 2021, and that's been baselined into the budget for 21-22. And we're seeing real pressures on what we need to maintain our existing assets and meet our life cycle costs going forward. So there are real pressures there.
Yeah. So moving on to the questions that I wanted to ask, can somebody tell me how much usable reserves that councils have, and when do you use your usable reserves?
Thank you, Gordon. I'll pick up on that first, and then perhaps Sarah or Eileen will want to come in. Obviously, it varies across all local authorities, the level of reserve that they have, and it's also dependent on what's committed reserves and what's uncommitted. So there's a lot of variation across the councils. I think one of the key things is that, yes, at what point do you use your reserves? I would say that everybody's always said you use them on a rainy day, and it's been chucking it down for the last 10 months. But what we don't want to do is exhaust reserves going forward and put councils into even further pressure next year, in next financial year, which is why we looked and worked constructively with government around some fiscal flexibilities that could perhaps assist councils to plug a budget gap in this financial year and next financial year. And I think that work has been constructive, that it's not a perfect solution, it's not a replacement for cash. But I do think there's a general understanding that some reserves will be required to be used in this financial year and next financial year, alongside the flexibilities and the additional cash that we do get for COVID funding over and above. But I think the challenge is going to be in future years, and we obviously don't want to reduce reserves to a point where Audit Scotland is not comfortable with our reserves. But as I say, it very much varies. I can't give you an exact figure for every council.
No, I appreciate that, and the Audit Scotland's report is quite helpful in that way. Can you tell me how many councils actually? I mean, sorry, Convener, I should have declared my wife has been a local government councillor for 14 years. So it's an issue that I'm well aware because I get my ears nipped on a regular basis about council funding. However, that being said, how many councils in the last financial year increased the reserves, the revenue reserves?
I'll bring Sarah in on this point because I think if they have, there's very specific reasons for that.
Yeah, I think Eileen and Martin are looking to come in on the issue of reserves.
So if you look at the Audit Scotland report, it highlights, I think, that 22 councils increased their reserves within 1920 to a scale of 65 million. Now, I think the largest increase was due to Glasgow, and we know that they had a significant equal pay claim. So what I would say about reserves are there to deal with one-off shocks in your budget. They're not there to deal with ongoing costs, and we all carry a number of risks. So within my council, our reserves have significantly reduced in recent years, and we're actually flagged up in the Audit Scotland report as well. If that continues, there is issues of sustainability. Now, obviously, I'll make sure that that isn't an issue, but it's really important that we do have a level of reserves because there are things that councils have to deal with which aren't funded by the Scottish Government due to the autonomy, how autonomous we are. So we really need to ensure that we do hold a level of reserves, and that's even more important in times of uncertainty. So I actually expect to see an increase in reserves at the end of this financial year, and that's partly because some of the funding that's coming from the Scottish Government and the fact that we're being asked potentially to carry that forward to next year to deal with things like COVID, education, health and social care. And we're also looking at fiscal flexibilities as well for dealing with COVID costs going forward. If councils access these, it will mean that the reserves increase in the short term so that they can deal with the medium-term impact of COVID going forward, which is going to be quite substantial and wide-ranging.
So in terms of... Sorry, I'll let you come in, Martin, before I ask my other question.
Sorry, thanks, Mr. McDonald. The position is that reserves there'll be a mixture of earmarked reserves and unearmarked reserves. The earmarked reserves for specific purposes. So, for example, Glasgow had quite a significant reserve built up to deal with its equal pay challenge and how that flowed through the accounts. So Glasgow's policy is for unearmarked reserves of 2% of net cost, net expenditure. Glasgow's below that target, not by a bit very much, but we're about 1.9%. So in Glasgow's case, that's about £30 million. Our pressure from COVID prior to the allocation of the lost income, 200 million, is sitting at about £80 million. So as Councillor McGregor said, it's been raining pretty hard this year from that point of view. So that's the scale of the problem. So our reserves are not big enough to deal with that current issue. Now that figure will reduce with the lost income figure and other issues that we're dealing with, but we're not awash with reserves, and I think that's pretty common across local government.
Just on that point, are you able to advise what the total value of the council's usable reserves are? I accept that councils are all in different places and there's fluctuation year on year, but where are we in terms of usable reserves, which can either be used to fund specific projects or general expenditure or to reduce council tax? So where are we with the total value of that?
Hold on, Eileen.
Mute. You're on mute.
Okay, so I can't give you that answer here and now. That's something that we would have to gather. I've not got time to kind of look in the Audit Scotland report and respond. But what I would say is the position on reserves varies significantly across councils and their risks vary. So there isn't a one size fits all. So I don't think we would say this is the level of reserves that councils require, because that changes given the risks that they all carry. So I think we need to look at reserves in that vein.
If you've got another question,
sorry?
If you've got another question, make it short.
Yeah, I will do. Council's usable reserves across Scotland, depending which year you take, is between 2 billion and 2.5 billion, which I would say is substantial usable reserves. And given that this is the time when it's absolutely pouring out there, given COVID and the Brexit situation, is it not time that councils were using the reserves to support services?
That's with you, Gail.
Sorry, yes. Yes, I can't disagree with that. I said at the start of answering the last time that it is pouring and councils will use their reserves. Absolutely.
That's me, convener, thanks.
Okay. All right, thanks very much. And now, finally, Alexander.
Thank you very much, convener. And can I thank COSLA for their analysis? That is very useful. And it's been very evident today that councils are suffering. They have suffered over the years from funding, but COVID has added even more pressure when you've talked about a loss of income and a reduction in core funding and the pressures of COVID that have been exacerbated. So many questions already have been asked, but I would like to sort of talk to the issue about how councils are having to adapt to support their service delivery and adopt new ways of working. That has been very evident over the last nearly a year, that councils have had little opportunity to do anything else but adapt to new ways of working, and that puts some pressure on what is taking place. So can I ask COSLA if that new way of working and the new service deliveries that are being looked at, how likely are they to continue as we move into and we come through this pandemic?
Thank you. I think it comes in a number of parts. As you're very aware, Alexander, we've been firefighting for a number of months as well, and I have to say that I cannot commend our staff enough for the tremendous effort across councils and indeed all of public sector in the last few months. It's been incredible. I think, as we touched on earlier on, some of the transformation programmes which were going through the process within councils have had to be put in abeyance to a point. Obviously, different ways of working have seen an awful lot more of our staff having to work from home and the pressures that come with that, the challenges through digital and connectivity and support and mental health, and there's been massive challenges. You'll be aware that I'm in the process of just about to launch a new digital strategy in conjunction with the Scottish Government, and I think from a transformational point of view, having good digital connectivity and ensuring that all of our communities have the right devices as well will assist us in some transformation, because the world isn't going to get back to normal the way it was, where we have customer facing services in person. So I think that councils have been incredibly good at adapting, but we have been firefighting, and I think what we're doing now is just trying to take a breath, and I say trying because it's very challenging, to look at what services we will need to be delivering. So, for instance, we talked about loss of income earlier on and the challenges around that. We don't know how public are going to feel about going back into community centres and leisure facilities. So we'll perhaps need to look at what offer we have for them in the coming months, and obviously reprofiling some of the work in sort of transformational ways with that. So I think what we need to do is protect our communities now, ensure that they are looked after, but then look at how we deliver key services to get us out of this. And then we go, as I say, into economic development and recovery as well. And councils will absolutely be at the heart of that, supporting people through employment and skills teams and just aiding a recovery. So I think the role that councils are doing will be three-part. We've been crisis, we're now in a holding pattern and just keeping going. And we're going into that phase now where we'll look forward and ensure that the services we are providing going down the line into recovery are absolutely what our communities need. And I think councils are brilliant at that.
And I would concur with all of that, Councillor McGregor. I do believe that people have gone the extra mile, and I do congratulate and commend them for all of that. So when Audit Scotland talked about the possibilities of changing and looking at workforce planning, and when they spoke about there was a need for much more of that to be addressed, what are your views on how that can be achieved during this crisis and pandemic? Because, you know, it's not the same. You can't expect people to do what they've done during the last year and then just switch a light and move on to where they're going to be the next year or two. And with the funding crisis that you have identified today, when you see your core funding being reduced, when you see a 21% reduction in capital expenditure, all of that has an impact on how you can effectively run your councils and support your communities.
No, absolutely. Again, I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on this point, and I don't want to monopolise, but fortunately I actually have the employers portfolio within my group as well, and they cut across finance and the whole of local government. So we've been doing significant work with the unions over the past 11 months, meeting with them very, very regularly to ensure that their members are supported, our employees are supported, and ensuring that where possible we get the right guidance out to heads of HR and line managers to, as I say, ensure that staff are supported. But moving forward, we do need to look at workforce planning, because the landscape is not going to be the same. We will have a higher proportion of people who may choose, if possible, to continue to work part-time from home, part-time in a face-to-face situation. We'll need to look at the challenges around that, as I say, in respect of mental health and isolation and supporting our staff. But certainly I think that the one positive that has come out of COVID, as I say, is the use of digital. And the fact that we're doing this meeting today, it's not as flowy as our in-person meetings, but it's manageable. So I think the way that we work will have to change. And as I say, as part of my employers' brief, we're working with the joint trade unions across the piece on that, and particularly as well in schools for teaching and non-teaching staff. It's been a massive effort and a very different way of working. So as I say, there's much work to be done.
And my final question, Convener, can I maybe ask Martin about the potential devastation to culture and leisure he's identified with their facilities not being able to support at present, and the likelihood of what after COVID that will look like? Because, as I say, my take on what is being said by Martin and others who have a role within that is that we will see a much more reduced support mechanism. We will see many of them possibly disappear from communities because of the financial strain that they are under, and they won't be able to sustain the support mechanisms within the communities to ensure that takes place.
Martin Bruce.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Stewart. And yes, absolutely, it's a really, really challenging area. My, I suppose, expertise in this area, I was previously Finance Director for Glasgow Life, which is the biggest culture and leisure trust in the country. And the impact of lost income is potentially devastating. So we have to take a much more, at least medium, if not long-term view to rebuild these services and to rebuild people's confidence in using these services, because as Councillor McGregor said, we're not sure how the public will react and how long it will take them to recover the level of confidence where they are comfortable in visiting. In Glasgow, we're doing quite a lot of engagement around that. We've just completed a staff survey, and again, our staff's confidence in visiting leisure centres as members of society, not as members of staff, is still relatively low. And that's staff. So the general public, which we're also carrying out a research through our household survey to gauge that level of confidence and what we can do to rebuild that level of confidence. But as has already been said, we're anticipating that will be a sort of 2, 3, 4 year programme, and we need the resources to be able to rebuild that. These are really, really critical services for the health of our nation, for the health of our citizens.
And
So,
without that resource coming into it, it will be, in reality, not able to support and will not be able to progress if the funding doesn't follow it for the future.
That's undoubtedly a significant risk, yes.
Thank you,
Okay.
Convener.
Thank you very much, Alexander. That completes our questions, and I want to thank the panel for taking time out to speak with us today and giving us some issues to ponder as the budget bill continues through Parliament. We will hear from the Scottish Government on this next week. The members of the panel can leave the meeting by pressing the red telephone icon, and I remind committee members that they remain in public for the next item. Thanks again for your help. Agenda item 7 is a consideration of statutory guidance sports club relief as listed on the agenda. I refer members to paper number 5, which contains further detail. This statutory guidance is not subordinate legislation, but is subject to the negative procedure. This is as a result of recommendations made by the DPLR committee and this committee earlier this session when we considered the non-domestic rates bill which the Scottish Government agreed to. This means that the guidance will come into force unless Parliament agrees a motion to annul them. No motions to annul have been laid. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered the guidance at its meeting on 26 January 2021 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the guidance on any grounds within its remits. Does anyone have any comments on the guidance? No? Okay. I therefore invite the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this guidance. Does anyone object? Okay, that is agreed. Agenda item 8 is a consideration of negative instrument 29 as listed on the agenda. I refer members to paper number 6, which contains further details. This instrument is laid under the negative procedure, which means that provisions will come into force unless the Parliament agrees to a motion to annul them. No motions to annul have been laid. Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee considered Instrument 29 at its meeting on the 2nd of February 2021 and determined that it did not need to draw the attention of the Parliament to the instrument on any grounds within its remit. Does anyone have any comments on the instrument? No. Okay. I therefore invite the committee to agree that it does not wish to make any recommendations in relation to this instrument. Does anyone object? No, that is therefore agreed. That concludes the public part of this meeting, and we will resume the meeting in private on Microsoft Teams. I propose we resume the meeting in private in 5 minutes. Please accept the clerk's meeting request for the private discussion, which will be sent shortly. You all know how to exit the meeting by clicking on the red telephone icon. Thank you.